The moment the CEO's son walked into our global logistics hub, wearing a $1,000 tailored suit and preaching about algorithmic synergy, I knew the freight lines were going to grind to a halt long before any train actually stalled on the tracks. I had spent 12 years keeping Apex freight systems moving, with cold brew, zero sleep, and absolute defiance. People like him glided through life thinking a Wharton MBA and a perfectly veneered smile made them superior to the operators grease-stained and red-eyed on the floor. What his glossy slides left out was brutal and simple. Supply chains don't run on branding. They run on exhausted, invisible operators quietly holding back catastrophe every single hour of the day. My name is Marcus Vance, and for over a decade, I ran the central dispatch and routing operations for a major intermodal freight network based out of Chicago. The title sounded corporate, but the reality was a hyper-caffeinated bunker filled with terminal screens, roaring emergency radios, and furious rail yard managers across 3 time zones. While retail customers wondered why their packages were 12 hours late, people like me were rerouting million-ton container trains around Midwestern blizzards, fixing critical track scheduling conflicts, and juggling long-haul truck drivers to prevent them from hitting federal drive time limits mid-interstate. The entire multi-billion-dollar operation relied on a legacy platform called Ironclad, a 40-year-old mainframe system stitched together by ancient code and custom patches that only a handful of veteran dispatchers could read. And I knew its pulse better than the men who coded it. Every shift broke the same way: bitter coffee, screen glare, and a mountain of logistical friction waiting to explode before the sun hit the skyline. On that specific Thursday, I clocked into the hub at 3 a.m. to find critical system alerts bleeding red across our primary switching matrix. A torrential downpour had flooded a key switching yard in Ohio. Pennsylvania crews were stranded, and the entire West Coast inbound corridor was bottlenecking outside Omaha. My shift supervisor, Greg, looked ready to collapse into his lukewarm breakfast. "Morning, Marcus," he groaned without looking up. "The grid is completely hemorrhaging." I dropped my bag, and my fingers hit the mechanical keyboard before he could finish the sentence. Within 20 minutes, I executed manual routing bypasses around the flood zones, pushed a direct memory patch to stabilize the server lag, and reallocated backup truck fleets to catch the stranded containers before client fines kicked in. The red indicators dissolved into a calm, steady green. That precise moment always brought a quiet rush of pride. The millions of Americans waking up to fully stocked grocery shelves would never know my name, but the country's heartbeat kept time because of decisions I finalized before their alarms went off. At 9:15 a.m., the gritty, high-stress atmosphere of the bunker shattered instantly. The heavy steel security doors slid open, and the scent of expensive cologne violently replaced our familiar aroma of ozone and stale diner food. In walked Julian Sterling, the founder's son, with his fiancée, Chloe, trailing a step behind, her iPad cradled like an offensive weapon. Julian had spent his 20s bouncing between European ski resorts and vague advisory boards, while the rest of us pulled 80-hour weeks to cover the company's expanding blind spots. Now, armed with a newly minted vice president title, he was determined to disrupt the industry. "Marcus," Julian said, his smile so sharp and hollow it felt like a dental commercial. "We're here to audit the floor today. My father agrees that the logistics division needs a modern, agile perspective." An agile perspective usually means an executive wants to slash the headcount, buy a software package that hasn't passed beta testing, and leave the wreckage for us to clean up, I said, eyes locked on my monitor. Chloe let out a patronizing little laugh, tapping her stylus against the tablet. She had been an executive lifestyle consultant before deciding that heavy freight infrastructure was her new playground. Within 10 minutes of standing on the floor, she was throwing out terms like redundancy elimination and workflow optimization, completely blind to the fact that she was looking at live, volatile, rail yard data, not a social media feed. By noon, they called an emergency session in the glass-walled executive boardroom, and that was when the true scale of the incoming disaster became terrifyingly clear. Julian stood before a massive laser projector, grandstanding about automated resource deployment, predictive AI scheduling, and the immediate reduction of unnecessary staffing. Chloe flipped through vibrant minimalist slides crammed with Silicon Valley catchphrases, while middle managers nodded silently, terrified for their jobs. Then Chloe pointed directly at our regional short-line tracks in the Pacific Northwest and announced their plan to completely decommission the human-manned regional switching towers, replacing them with a centralized, automated algorithm to increase efficiency. I stared at her in disbelief. Those manual towers exist because the mountain passes have massive dead zones where satellite signals drop completely, I explained, my voice deadpan, but loud enough to stop her mid-sentence. On top of that, the local manufacturing clients require irregular, on-demand shunting that an automated long-haul algorithm will completely lock out. You cut those towers and you'll destroy the regional supply chain, financially within months. Julian waved his hand dismissively, the casual arrogance of a man who had never held a wrench or answered a midnight panic call. That's legacy thinking, Marcus. We need hyper-scalable, friction-free solutions. That was the exact second I knew arguing was worthless. This wasn't a business strategy. It was an exercise in pure vanity. They loathed the existence of operators like me, because our deep, specialized knowledge served as a permanent reminder that their expensive titles didn't actually give them the capability to run the business alone. It was completely legal personal workflow optimization. If my security credentials disappeared, the root directory would self-archive and lock. The scripts would simply cease to exist on the live network. At 3 p.m., I walked into the HR office. Julian sat next to Chloe, looking like a king who had just conquered a small village, while the HR director stared intently at her desk blotter, refusing to meet my eyes. Julian leaned back, tenting his fingers dramatically. Marcus, after a comprehensive assessment of our operational culture, we've concluded that your approach no longer aligns with the future vision of Apex Freight. Translation, I said, dropping my hands into my pockets. You're firing the only person who keeps the freight moving. Chloe interjected, her voice dripping with artificial corporate empathy. Your negativity has become toxic for the workplace transformation. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It was utterly delusional. 12 years of missing holidays, burning out my health, and fixing their catastrophic mistakes in the dead of night. And I was toxic because I questioned people who had no idea what they were doing. Julian delivered the final blow. Your termination is effective immediately. I unclipped my security badge and laid it flat on the table, without a single word of protest. Then I looked directly into Julian's eyes. You think you just bought a self-driving machine, Julian, but you just threw the engineer off the train while it's going 90 miles an hour. As I opened the door, I looked back one last time. Just so you know, the master routing manifest cache forces a hard system-wide sync at 4:15 p.m. Julian gave a smug smirk. Our automated architecture will handle it seamlessly. I left the building, crossed the street to a quiet, dimly lit bar near the terminal, and ordered a double shot of bourbon. I pulled out my personal tablet and loaded the public freight tracking dashboards. At exactly 4:15 p.m., the ironclad system initiated its automated global sync. When the server attempted to ping the background routing architecture, it hit the wall where my deleted credentials used to be. The custom scripts vanished from the live environment. The disintegration was spectacular. Within 15 minutes, a minor routing lag in Chicago ballooned into a total system failure. By 4:30, automated gate assignments at our 4 largest intermodal hubs completely corrupted. Digital manifests wiped themselves clean, leaving hundreds of long-haul trucks locked outside freight yards, unable to load or unload. Container trains ground to a halt at red signals because the central system could no longer verify track occupancy. Within an hour, the Federal Railroad Administration stepped in and issued an emergency freeze order on our entire rail network. The airline of freight froze completely. Passengers and cargo were stranded everywhere, and news stations started reporting system-wide logistics failures. My phone transformed into a solid block of vibrating plastic. Dozens of frantic calls from desperate floor operators and field managers flooded my log, begging for help. Julian called 7 times back-to-back. Chloe sent a barrage of texts, claiming people were suffering because of supply chain delays and demanding I act professionally. I blocked both of them. Then, at 7 p.m., the private line buzzed. It was Lawrence Sterling, the reclusive founder of the company. Unlike his soft Ivy League son, Lawrence was an old-school titan who had built Apex from a single second-hand locomotive decades ago. His voice sounded older, completely stripped of its usual armor. "Marcus," he said, the exhaustion heavy through the speaker. "The yards are in total gridlock. We're losing millions every hour. Come back tonight and fix this. I will fire Julian. I will fire Chloe. Name your salary. Name your title." For a fleeting second, the old operational instinct sparked in my chest. Part of me missed the raw, electric chaos of solving a nationwide puzzle under pressure. But then the memory of the insults returned. The smug smiles, the warnings ignored, the absolute disregard for experience. "You let them rip the foundation out of your own house, Lawrence," I said quietly into the phone. "Now you have to live with the collapse." The financial fallout was absolute. Apex Freight lost tens of millions of dollars over the next 4 days. Contracts with major retailers were terminated instantly, investors panicked, and the stock price cratered. The investigative journals dug into the collapse, exposing the exact truth about my firing. By Monday morning, every major competitor in the industry knew my name. 2 days later, I accepted an executive consulting contract with one of our largest rivals for nearly triple my old salary. They wanted my knowledge, not my obedience. I now work comfortably from home, rebuilding their systems while watching my former company collapse on television. A week later, Julian was fired. 6 months later, Apex Freight was broken up and sold off in pieces to liquidators. Sometimes during the quiet hours of the morning, I still miss that operations center. I miss the flashing green monitors, the intense pressure, and the feeling of keeping a continent moving before the world wakes up. But then I remind myself of something important. Companies love to call workers replaceable, right up until the moment they discover exactly how expensive the replacement really is. The ghost in the machine. Over the next 2 weeks, Apex Freight became unrecognizable. Veteran yardmasters and dispatchers were pushed out the door in waves, replaced by slick automated software suites that threw errors every time a cloud blocked a transponder signal. The critical midnight support crew was entirely dissolved because Julian claimed nothing important happened after midnight, completely ignoring the fact that our overnight shifts handled the massive multi-million-dollar international cargo handoffs. Every written memo and verbal warning I submitted was thrown into the trash. Chloe began sitting at the desk next to mine during active tracking hours, asking absurd questions while scrolling through her luxury travel feeds. "Why can't we just color-code the train speeds to look cleaner?" she asked. "The colors aren't an aesthetic choice, Chloe," I muttered, slamming a series of manual overrides to prevent a freight train from entering an occupied block in Texas. "They tell me whether I need a mechanic or a miracle. Visual design won't change physics." She scoffed, rolling her eyes, and told me I needed a more positive attitude toward digital evolution. 2 weeks later, the calendar invite popped into my inbox from corporate HR. No agenda, no context. I didn't need one. Before I stood up from my terminal, I quietly executed a final, meticulous sequence I had been preparing over the last 48 hours. Over 12 years, I had written hundreds of custom Python scripts and API workarounds to keep the ancient ironclad platform talking to modern tracking hardware. These scripts managed automated manifest generation, emergency rail switch overrides, crew schedule syncing, and database corruption recovery during power drops. Because the corporate tech stack was too rigid, these tools were never officially integrated into the master codebase. They lived locally, running entirely out of my secure, encrypted employee root directory.